Welcome to this joint session of SMPTE and AES. My name is Gary Epstein, along with my colleagues Bruce Black and Lon Newman. I'm a principal of Immersive Audio Alliance. I know many of you from my history at Dolby broadcast and some cinema and home theater work. Glad to see you all here. In any case, tonight we have an exciting program that deals with preparing movie soundtracks for delivery to the home environment. Our presenters will tell you about the complex workflows that ensure high-quality sound deliveries for home viewing of movies. They have each been instructed to prepare 20-minute segments on the topic. At the conclusion, we will open the floor for question and answers. Without further delay, let me introduce our first presenter, my colleague Lon Newman, who has also produced this program. Let me give you a little background on Lon. As principal in the Immersive Audio Alliance, Lon is involved in the designing and implementation of near-field immersive audio systems in the professional production applications. As a consulting engineer at Neumann Technologies, amongst other things, he has written the audio delivery specification for the PBS network. At DTS, he was product manager responsible for developing surround sound encoders. He was the Western Operations Manager for Sony's SACD Super Audio Compact Disc project, where he spent years enabling surround sound production of music content. Not done yet. Previously, he was Chief Engineer for Stevie Wonder's Wonderland Studios, having already won an award for the live mix of Earth, Wind & Fire's nationwide tour. He went on to become a field applications engineer for first Mitsubishi Pro Audio and then at Sony Pro Audio. Lon will give us an overview of the significant aspects differentiating cinema sound from TV sound and guidelines for utilizing the features of the medium to the fullest extent. Please welcome Lon.
By the way, with all due respect, it's Neumann, like the microphone. I thought I'd put that out there. I've got a lot of stuff to cover here tonight, and so I'm going to have to talk really fast to squeeze it in. So please, if anything isn't completely clear, try to capture that, and we'll get to it in the Q&A. So. Commercial exhibition spaces and home theaters are distinctly different, obviously. So to optimize the home theater and other so-called TV experiences, now including online streaming and handheld smartphones, movie soundtracks must go through a transformation process to become suitable for home theaters. Excuse me. The dominant AC3 encoding format also has its own set of distinctive requirements. We'll discuss the processes of converting from movies to TV in ways that enable harnessing the possibilities to the fullest extent. So let me just say now, and hopefully I'll repeat it for emphasis, and all of this, overall, critical listening in properly set up conditions is by far the most important thing, both for judging loudness and spatial imaging. So we have a lot of technical systems, but really it comes down to listening. Here's an overview of some of the things that we're going to touch on tonight. We're going into the AC3 encoding because it is the dominant codec. In time, others will come into common usage, especially AC4, as included in ATSC 3.0, as 5G rolls out one of these days. So, so cinema and TV have two distinctly frames of reference for alignment. The two are fundamentally different. In cinema, there is what we have now learned to call this new term, allocentric. It's not actually new, but it's new to us. But it's the cinema frame of reference that encodes spatial images that originate at the walls, the perimeters. And but that's decidedly not the case in the home environment, which has this term that's we now know as the egocentric, that encodes spatial images relative to the position of the observer. So content created with cinema frame of reference needs to be converted to the home theater frame of reference. So in making the translation from one to the other, it's really important to QC with critical listening that should be performed to ensure that the preservation of the artistic intent. So here is a picture of a typical cinema alignment, an allocentric configuration. There's many variations on this. This is a really simplified version, but what they all have in common is that the loudspeakers are positioned at the perimeters, like as it, well, I was going to say in this room, but actually that cluster up there is not, it's a different story. But typically in cinema, they are, the speakers are at the perimeters. But at home, we have this configuration, an egocentric configuration, if you will. So you can see that in this case, the speakers are all equidistant from a central point of measurement. So that describes a circle. And by the way, let me point out that it's not a straight line across the front. If you see a straight line across the front without any other compensation, it will be a distortion in loudness and imaging. All of the speakers are equidistant from a central point of measurement. And notice too that the picture screen at 2 picture heights goes from left to right for proper panning. So some other things you don't see here, but I'll just touch on quickly that the speakers, the 5 speakers should be identical. They should measure flat in an anechoic space. They need wide dispersion. And there will be room mode resonances, and that's another story for another day. But so as I was saying, critical listening is really the most important thing. So we're going to begin by discussing some of the issues of properly aligning and calibrating the loudspeaker monitors as described in this wonderful document from the ATSC, the A85 document, which is still the best collection of useful guidance on this topic. I really believe so. But one of the reasons it's so important is shown here graphically, and this is from Dr. Toole's book here that shows depicts the precedence effect or the Haas effect, the reason for it. If you have a phantom image, say center on a stereo system, and where you have equal loudness of, say, speech, for example, going to both speakers, you will create a phantom image in the center. However, if you shift it just a little, less than a millisecond even, or it begins at less than a millisecond, that image will snap to the closest speaker. So that's one of the really important reasons why we need precise alignment to maintain the proper imaging. And there is another reason, which I will try to demonstrate here, if I don't fumble, which, as you will see, what happens when you offset one speaker versus another that should be. We start with a single signal, and then we add another one that's coincident. And then if you offset it in time, like just by displacing it a little bit in space, look what happens to the frequency response. There's this comb filter that accrues. So it's another reason. I mean, this is a distortion. This was not in the original. The creative people didn't want it there, and it's a distortion. So it's another reason why there needs to be critical alignment. So there's this little matter, the X-curve, and Dr. Toole will be taking a deeper dive on that. But this is a picture of the X-curve, and let me just say that cinema has it, TV doesn't have it. So if you're going from content that was created on systems that were equalized to the X-curve, delivering to a system that doesn't have the X-curve, you need to at least do QC in a space that doesn't have the X-curve and make any compensations that you might find necessary. And then there is this issue of calibration levels. Cinema is calibrated to 85 dB SPL, Well, as shown in this table from A85, the document I was mentioning, we are going to be working in smaller spaces that are like living room type spaces, I should say we're delivering to those kinds of spaces. So we also want to be working in such spaces and that'll be smaller, and the calibration level needs to be substantially less. A85 recommends, as you can see, either 70, 78 or 76 dB, dependent on the room volume. Here's a reason why that's important, because we hear differently at different levels, and we know that the consumers are going to be listening at substantially lower levels. So we need to calibrate our production systems because we're going to be hearing differently at different level. Here is the calibration procedure from 85. I won't go into it in great depth now, but there's a well-defined procedure for loudspeaker calibration 85 that should be observed. So now, as standardized by the ATSC, the AC3 system utilized in TV delivers content to the output of the consumer's decoder that is normalized to uniform loudness. So we're going to get into that in just a bit, but so the good news there is when it's done correctly, it allows the listener the freedom to exert some control over the dynamic range that best suits their listening conditions and other benefits. So let's see here what happened. So AC3, part of what happens with AC3, besides the compression, the data rate reduction, there's a whole slew of metadata that gets encoded and delivered along with the essence. So this is important stuff. Some of it's important, at least, but it's really important to know how the metadata will be created at the time that the content is authored, which will be at the time of the AC3 encode. So as was mentioned, I wrote the delivery spec for PBS Network, and part of what I did, and which I believe which I really believe is a good idea, is to publish what the metadata is going to be and what it is going to, what it's going to be, how it's going to get encoded, how it's going to be authored. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But notice up at the top is this parameter that is known as dial norm, and we're going to talk about that some more. So, but regarding dial norm, it's way back at the beginning of ATSC, in the A5, at the stage of when A53 was developed, the standard that's part of the suite of ATSC standards, right from the beginning, it has always said that the dial norm basically dial norm needs to tell the truth about the average level of normally spoken dialogue. And the whole system kind of is contingent upon that being true for different reasons that we'll get into here. But it's so important that this is actually, by the way, has the power of law. It's not enforced, but this is, but it's really important that the dial norm parameter in the metadata has to tell the truth about the average level of normally spoken dialogue. So the ATSC guidance for loudness management has been influenced by this research paper that's shown here, defining what loudness it is that the audience prefers, and conversely what annoys the audience. So it developed this concept of loudness range that has come to be known as the comfort zone, within which a listener will accept loudness changes of normally spoken dialogue during and between programs. And here then is a chart showing the comfort zone. And you see it's not really locked down at 0 as the normal. They're actually comfortable for a range, but you can see there as it gets farther afield from that they gradually become hopping mad, and nobody wants that. So dial norm is really the single most important metadata parameter, and as you'll see in a moment, it normalizes the output at the decoder, and it is also necessary for DRC, for the dynamic range compression, which we'll touch on just briefly. So here's a bunch of content that got collected just at random. sort of. And you can see that there's the white bar represents the measured level of the average level of normally spoken dialogue, and then there's the dynamic range that goes beyond that. And here are what those values would turn out to be. So once it passes through the process of encoding, including dial norm creation and normalization at playout, this is the result. So in all of these cases, the average of the normally spoken dialogue will be normalized. There's still plenty of room for shouting and whispering, but it's the average level of normally spoken dialogue that gets normalized. This is the algorithm. This is the cover, a piece of the cover page that is the current version of the algorithm that's used. This is BS.1770-4. So this is the latest version, now having systems for gating the measurement. It's a two-stage gate. There's an absolute low-level gate, and then there's relative gating. This gating is not really so much a problem in itself in general. However, in practice, it turns out that it can cause problems for us because some systems disallow using this gating method along with the much more important dialogue-based gating of dialogue intelligence for controlling loudness measurements. So if a system does allow both, then it's probably not a problem. But if not, as I think Scott will mention, it's really it's better to revert to the original version of BS.1770, which we now call -1, if that's the only way that will enable dialogue gating, because dialogue gating is really so important. And here then is the white paper that presented the concept in the first place that led to, it was a collection of 7 algorithms that the bottom line is that it's an intelligent system that will find the normally spoken dialogue in the program and gate the measurement, the loudness measurement, so that you are measuring the normally spoken dialogue. You're focused on the dialogue for your measurement, and that really is critical. And this is the best way to do it. There's other ways to do it, but this is the most reliable, and it's automatic, and it works really well. So this leads quite directly into the story of DRC. So DRC is dynamic range control, and you can see there's some aspects of it shown up here, but it keeps people happy when it's working as it's intended. When you're having to listen in noisy environments, you can hear the low-level stuff without getting blown out by the high-level stuff. And also at late night when the babies are sleeping or the neighbors are next door sleeping, you want to be able to hear the low-level stuff without blown out with the high-level stuff. And it's important to understand that DRC is not baked in to the delivery stream. It's in the metadata, so it's there to be used if you want at the consumer side, but you don't have to use it. It can always be ignored. So, but with normally spoken dialogue in the null zone, which I'll show you here in a second, it really works very well. And there's a choice of profiles, which I'll show you too. So here's the general case for the profile, and notice that in the really critical part is in the center, the null band where there's no action, which is centered, when it's done properly, is to be centered at the level of the average of normally spoken dialogue. So you have that region there where nothing is happening. It's just a straight linear function, and that's where you want your dialogue to live, where it's not getting touched. But the louder stuff can be compressed, and lower stuff is brought up. So, but it's contingent upon dial norm telling the truth about the loudness of average spoken dialogue. It doesn't know where this is, except in as much as you've told it by how you've encoded that parameter in the metadata after you've confirmed either by measurement to make sure that the average of your dialogue is what you say it is in the dial norm parameter, so that this null zone occurs. But at the time of authoring, when you do the encode, you have a choice of several profiles. By the way, in AC4, this will be greatly expanded to allow even custom external profiles. But these are the standard 5 profiles that have always been there from the beginning. And you'll see that there's great variation in the width of the null zone, for example, that I just showed you. It varies from one to the other. There are also variations available in the maximum boost and cut, and also in the compression and boost ratios. So that selection of the profile happens at the time of authoring when you do the encode. So then you have this situation where there's all this metadata, some of which is actually controlling then when it gets to the consumers, but if you don't do something about it, you're not going to hear it. You're not going to hear those effects in production. So you need to do something about that because you want to hear what the consumer is going to be hearing. So there are different ways of going about it. You could invest in an encoder and a decoder, and you could run it into the encoder where you add the metadata, and you put it into a decoder where the metadata, the controlling metadata, does what it does, and then you could listen to the results. But that's kind of a waste. It's really overkill. So another better way of doing that is with something like an emulator, such as this nice emulator from Dolby, where you plug in the metadata that you know is going to be there, and then you can hear the effects that the consumer is going to be hearing, which you otherwise wouldn't know because if you just send it off without some system of emulation. And significant amongst that is the gain reduction display, so that you can get confirmation that the DRC is doing the job that you intend it to do. You can hear it on the one hand, but you can also get visual confirmation so that you could see, let's see if I get my pointer working. What you want to see is nothing happening here when you have normal dialogue. If your normal dialogue is compressing, if there's gain reduction, if these are moving at all with normal dialogue, you got a problem, and you really want to figure it out and solve the problem. So you should be able to listen to it, and you should be able to see visual confirmation of it as well. There's this other issue that has come up in practice that wasn't expected at the outset, which has to do with downmix loudness. So when you create surround content and you send it to the home, part of the metadata is controlling downmix. And so and probably most consumers are listening to the downmix from the surround content. So you need to know what the loudness is going to be when you do your downmix. And so that's an additional thing that hadn't been anticipated at the outset. It's generally when it becomes a problem is when people spread the center across the speakers on the front. That's what leads to the problem. But anyway, you need to check it when you're in production. We have some new developments. Obviously, we have object-based immersive audio now. Here's a picture of the cinema, but now we have a new home object-based immersive Atmos, shall we say. I'm sorry, there are others, but so in the new world of AC4 that will be with us here shortly, there are a bunch of new things that are really pretty cool. And so to summarize, here are the things that we covered really quickly, but let me just say one more time. All in all, by far, the most important thing is listening on properly aligned and calibrated monitors in a room that's similar to the home environment. And with that, I'll park this and hand off. Thank you very much.
I'm going to introduce Floyd Toole, and Floyd, look what you have to look forward to with PowerPoint here.
Yes.
Dr. Toole received his PhD from Imperial College of Science and Technology at the University of London. After many years as a senior research officer at the National Research Council of Canada, he went on to become the vice president of acoustical engineering at the JBL division of Harman International. He is passionate about the application of good science in service to art. His measurement technique is a core component of the Consumer Technology Association's standard method of measurement for in-home loudspeakers. He is a fellow and past president of the AES, fellow of the Acoustical Society of America, and a fellow of CEDIA, the Custom Electronic Design and Installation Association. His book, Sound Reproduction, The Acoustics and Psychoacoustics of Loudspeakers in Rooms, has become a standard reference in the industry. He has been recognized with many awards, including the AES Board of Governors Award for service to the industry and the CEDIA Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. Toole will speak to us about the X-curve in cinema, what it is and how it came to be, and its role going forward. Please welcome Dr. Toole.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening. What I'm going to talk about is different from most of the rest. It's the nuts and bolts of audio. My focus has been sound quality because if without high quality sound, nothing can be truly pleasurable. I'm sorry about my voice, it's a little husky tonight. So we're going to deal with two parts of the audio world, the cinema scene and the rest. In 20 minutes, I can't possibly cover all of this. You're going to end up with more questions than answers, I suspect. And if you want to dig deeper into it, I can only suggest my own book. That's the commercial message. Or something that's totally free. Just go on the AES.org website, go to publications, look up open access and type my name in, and this will come up and you can download it. It contains a lot of information, some of which you're going to hear tonight. Industries need standards, of course. In our business, we want to create a situation where sound playback systems are such that the creators of the programs, the content, experience something close to what the customers hear. Then they don't have to make any real guesses about what's going to be delivered. It can't be perfect. Nothing will ever be perfect in this world, but this is the goal. In the film world, about 50 years ago, the goal was to create this situation for mixers in dubbing stages so that they would hear what audiences in cinemas heard. And it was, and still is, a really good idea. The actual standard to which this would adhere really isn't terribly important unless it's totally ridiculous, so long as it's consistently applied within that cinema system of the dubbing stage to the cinema. Two standards were created, SMPTE and ISO standards, which are similar. And then the X-curve, which you've heard about, is part of that standard, those standards. But things change. Nothing's forever. And movies that were created for cinemas and only cinemas, now we can watch on our smartphones and in our homes, of course, anywhere we really want to listen or watch. And at home, people listen in smaller rooms, mostly through smaller audio systems, and they play back at their own chosen listening levels, which will be much lower than cinema calibrated sound reference sound levels. There are, of course, elaborate, powerful home theaters. I have one, and there are no limitations. I mean, I can go deaf in mine if I want to. There are common practices that are applied throughout this industry, home theater and domestic audio in general. There are standards for domestic playback systems and studio monitoring, but they're different from the X-curve, and that, as you've already heard, is the problem. So there's an enormous audience that's really not addressed by the movie standard, and this is the difficulty, and it needs to be addressed in some way or other. Frequency response, you're going to see some curves, and that's why I'm standing out here so I can see them and point to things in them. Frequency response is the most important factor in any audio system or component. If it's wrong, nothing else matters. You can have zero distortions, zero phase shift, zero everything else. But if the frequency response, the amplitude versus frequency response is bad, it's going to sound bad. In electronics, simple inputs and outputs, you just go for flat over the audible frequency range. It's been that way for as long as I can remember. A single curve describes performance, but loudspeakers are different because they radiate sound in all directions. Some sound will go from a loudspeaker in all directions at different frequencies. So a single curve cannot describe the sounds that reach our ears through reflections in rooms that originate in loudspeakers in cinemas and loudspeakers in domestic rooms. There are two very common metrics. You see them everywhere. Direct sound, which is the first arrival, it's often described or best described by the anechoic on-axis response, which is this: you aim the speaker at you, the first sound is the on-axis response of the loudspeaker, and very probably, that's the best performance that loudspeaker is capable of. Then there's the room curve, something you stick a little microphone up and around where you're sitting, and you make a measurement. And this is the classic measurement. It's been around forever, pink noise and real-time analyzers, third octaves. It really is the combination of the direct and all of the reflected sounds that arrive at that microphone from all directions at all times. And it really is a fact that neither of these metrics, however common they are and however comfortable we are looking at them and even measuring them, but neither one of them alone is a reliable indicator of sound quality. Why? Well, because 2 ears and a brain are way more complicated, way more analytical than a simple omnidirectional microphone and a little analyzer. We hear things in that three-dimensional sound field with sounds coming at us from different directions at different times and different amplitudes that are not really analyzable by this simple omnidirectional microphone. It doesn't discriminate as our ears and brain do. And that's a problem. Now, the X-curve, which you've seen, you say, well, why did anybody draw a curve with a straight edge rather than a French curve? I mean, let's just be reasonable here. I don't know how this ever got excused at any point in time, but I mean, you just don't do that sort of thing. But so now they say, yes, well, the technician should roll it off. Well, okay, I hope they do. But just to see, to give you an example of how far this is away from what we hear at home, this is a typical room curve, a steady-state room curve in a normal domestic home system, home theater system, home listening system, stereo, mono, doesn't matter. But, you know, in reality, it turns out that the direct sound, that first sound that arrives at our ears from the loudspeakers, it dominates our impressions in several ways. It triggers the precedence effect, which you heard about earlier, but it is very important in our impressions of sound quality. So it turns out that after doing almost 50 years of double-blind listening tests, I can say with some confidence that loudspeakers with flat and smooth meaning no resonances, flat meaning spectrum is balanced, flat and smooth on-axis responses get the highest scores, just monotonously, amazingly, routinely. And in the double-blind tests, of course, without any visual biases, most people agree. The only people who don't agree are those who have broken microphones, hearing loss. So how do cinema and home systems compare with respect to the direct sound? I showed you the steady-state sound comparisons. Let's look at the direct sounds. And in the book and in the paper, you'll see how this prediction came about. And this is just understanding the physics of the sound field and the performance of loudspeakers. You can predict this. Above about 700 hertz, there is no difference between, in a cinema, there's no difference between the direct sound and the steady-state sound. They are the same. And as you go down in frequency, it turns out that the direct sound, direct sounds are in black, steady-state sounds are in red. The direct sound is lower. So the direct sound arrives, and then the bass rises as the reflected sounds from the omnidirectional woofers accumulate. Louis Fielder of Dolby in 2012 did an absolutely wonderful paper describing this. He went out and I don't know whether he did it himself, but somebody went out and measured it, made a whole bunch of measurements in a whole bunch of cinemas. And here they are. This is the average of what he calls the typical 500-seat cinema. See, there's no difference between the direct and the steady-state sounds up here. But the bass is all over the place. This is the average here. So the average direct sound arrives, and then the average bass sound, steady-state sound, builds up after that. So there's bass rise after the arrival of the direct sound. These smaller graphs are for 50 front loudspeakers in 18 cinemas. And so you can see that the different acoustics of these cinemas make a huge difference to how the direct and steady-state sounds accumulate at our 2 ears and brain. Now you get into the home situation, things are much different. We're much closer and the rooms are smaller and so on. And the average curve for subjectively high-rated domestic speakers looks pretty much like that. And the direct sound is just flat frequency response. So you put a flat frequency response loudspeaker in a living room or recording studio control room or something, and you'll measure a steady state that rises at low frequencies. Down at low frequencies in small rooms, things all go to hell because of standing waves. So you have to deal with that as a separate problem that doesn't exist in very large spaces. Some important basics. Almost all loudspeakers start life being intended to be flattish on axis. Some succeed better than others. Sometimes the marketing department gets involved and decides what the customer should be hearing today. This year, what's in fashion this year. But on the average, and I have masses and masses of data over 50 years, loudspeakers are flat on axis, give or take. Some do it better than others. And listeners in double-blind tests like this. They award these speakers with the highest scores. But all forward-firing loudspeakers, and I'm using forward-firing because that's typical of the woofers and tweeters in our living rooms by and large, and all of the cinema speakers. These are forward-firing loudspeakers. They are omnidirectional at low frequencies. They radiate their sound equally in all directions. That's simply because they are small compared to the wavelengths at these very low frequencies. Wavelength at 100 hertz is 11 feet. And it gets longer as you go down. So, and they become progressively more directional at higher frequencies. Therefore, the sound energy radiated into a normally reflective cinema or domestic room rises at low frequencies. The more reflective the room, the greater will be the bass rise. So that if you take a loudspeaker out of a box, cinema speaker, home theater speaker, hi-fi speaker, it doesn't matter, and just park it in its place and measure it in a room, the default room curve will rise at low frequencies. And it's not just loudspeakers that do this. Almost everything we listen to is small compared to the wavelengths at low frequencies. And so all these musical instruments and the human voice become progressively more omnidirectional. They tend towards omnidirectionality at low frequencies. This is the directivity index. 0 is omnidirectional. Get into these speakers, big cinema speaker, big monitor loudspeaker, control room monitor speaker, and a living room speaker. You can see that the big cinema speaker has that characteristic, the medium-sized one, that one. And so these are all fairly consistent, and they all end up omnidirectional at low frequencies. So what we have to do when we measure a speaker is measure all the way around it. And in 1983, I started the basis of this in Ottawa, Canada. And we do a 2-orbit measurement, horizontal orbit and a vertical orbit. It makes sense because we listen in rooms with vertical walls and horizontal floor and ceiling. Those are the strongest reflections we're likely to hear. The second loudest sounds we hear in a room are those reflections. And we measure with high precision and high resolution. We get lots and lots of detail. And then we process those 70 curves, 70 curves, just to measure a damn loudspeaker. Right? And the on-axis curve, obviously, is the one that aims at you in the listening space. We also measure what we call the listening window, plus or minus 30 degrees, plus or minus 10 degrees vertically. And just to give an idea, an average idea of the direct sound arriving at an audience. Early reflections give you the energy sum of the strongest early reflections. And then we have the sound power, which is everything radiated in all directions and arriving eventually at the listener. And then from that, the difference between the direct sound and the sound power is the definition of the directivity index, which is 0 at low frequencies and omnidirectional, becoming progressively more directional as we go up in frequency. And this spinorama is now the basis of this standard. It's for consumer products, but it has application even in the cinema. Loudspeakers that are awarded these highest ratings in double-blind listening tests are monotonously similar in their measurements. And when they measure similarly, they sound monotonously similar too. So we really can measure what we hear up to a point if we do enough of the right kinds of measurements and process them accordingly. The direct sound from these highly rated loudspeakers is just really, really flat on axis and within the listening window. If you do the steady state room curve for that loudspeaker, it'll rise gently at low frequencies. rolling off a little bit at high frequencies, partly because of the air absorption. There's a little bit of it even at 3 meters. So the steady state curve is tilted due to the bass rise. If you take those loudspeakers into a bunch of different living rooms, and I actually got some of these curves off the internet done by amateurs with their own equipment. I have no idea what they measured with, but the curves are fine. I mean, you can, above some frequency, above the frequency where the room modes take over and corrupt the bass. What we're measuring in rooms is not very different from what we measure in the anechoic chamber, and that red curve is, I'll argue it's a reasonable average. Not perfect. Now these room mode problems go away as the rooms get bigger. This is a small domestic room. This is a 10-seat home theater, 350-seat cinema, 800 seats. By the time you get up into bigger cinemas, the room resonance problem goes away. The loudspeaker becomes even more dominant as an influence on what we are hearing. Then there's this transition region where they argue with each other. It just is there. Looking into the literature to see what might exist for experiments trying to evaluate room curves that correlate with listener preferences, there's not much in the literature. People just don't do this kind of research. The first, and in a way, the most interesting and important one was done by Ljungberg in Sweden in 1969. It's in the SMPTE journal. And those of you who have access to it, I really suggest you go back and dig it out and read it. It's educational. Ljungberg really did understand what was going on. He said you need high-resolution measurements to understand what the speaker's doing. Then you reduce the resolution to measure in the room, because you cannot learn once the speaker is radiating sound into a three-dimensional space. You're out of luck trying to figure out what that speaker is actually doing. I mean, you can do it in the anechoic chamber, no problem. The anechoic chamber is not the room, so you have to do both maybe. But we get very close to predicting what happens in a room from what we measure in the anechoic chamber if we do enough of the measurements. But you can see that here we have 1969, 1975, 1980, 2016, and look at how good they agree. My goodness, this is a 4 dB window, 4, plus or minus 2 dB. I'm staggered and amazed, frankly, but all this is what happens. I love science, and if you do things properly, you get the same answers. Question is it the answer you want? Well, if you're selling the X-curve, the answer is no. So let's just compare what these say, what this other data is telling us. This dashed curve is the average of what I just showed you, that. And the solid curve is the average of what we have in small domestic rooms. So that's big. The dashed curve is for large venues. The solid curve is for small venues. The difference between them at high frequencies is totally air absorption. At home, we listen at 3 meters. In the cinema, we listen at maybe 10 meters, 15 meters, long distances, a lot of air absorption. So that's just air absorbing the higher frequencies. And cinemas have much higher reverberation times than our homes do. So, I mean, the bass is going to rise, and they have larger speakers, and so there's more tilt to the bass. So the difference between these red curves is totally explainable by physics. It's not mysterious. And it turns out that both of those curves are the curves that result from forward-firing loudspeakers that radiate flat on-axis or flat direct sound. Amazing, isn't it? 2 ears and a brain are wonderful for extracting the essence of truth from really complicated circumstances. And neither of those agrees with the X-curve. Now, what happens when people calibrate cinemas? And fortunately, due to some significant effort put in by a team of SMPTE people, I observed a couple of these, but other people did the sweat. They measured 16, there are 16 curves measured in X-curve calibrated cinemas here. They come from SMPTE data and from Philip Newell in Europe. So it comes from, some of these are American, some of these are European. In Europe, by the way, you can pay extra to get the technicians to actually make that kink. That's a bad joke, but it's true. It's true. You pay €100 and you'll get that kink. All right, so now you can see that these blue curves, this is the combination of the SMPTE and the Newell data, 16 cinemas, they're not tightly grouped at all. They're all over the place, in fact. But the interesting thing is that the base rises. The average curve in these calibrated cinemas rises at low frequencies, because in order to arrive at this flat X curve target, you've got to turn the base down. And I don't know about you, but I always hated to turn the base down. Base is hard enough to get. And, a little too much base is one of those forgivable sins. So it turns out that, if you take those curves, turn them red, and put them on top of the blue curves, that's what it looks like. And in fact, it turns out that just for whatever reason, technicians calibrating these 16 cinemas hit the target. It's just barely within the X-curve tolerances, but it isn't the X-curve. The base rises. Now, maybe they listened and liked it and left it that way. Maybe they did. I don't know. I just say why. I don't know. At high frequencies, even the X-curve calibrations fall on the low side, some of them outside the X-curve tolerance even. So they let the bass rise and they let the treble fall. Don't know. This knee is an obnoxious thing. It shouldn't be there. But if anybody did take the spirit of the French curve and roll that off a little bit, even then they would have come closer to these red curves. So really, those curves are the hi-fi curves, and the X curve is the X curve. So the common factor in all of this is that two ears in the brain seem to extract and recognize something important in the direct first arrived sound. It should be neutral, should be flat and smooth. The X-curve method does not do this. Standardization is essential, I grant you that, but compatibility with all of the audience would seem to be a worthwhile objective. We're simply not there yet, that's all. Thanks.
Okay, let's move on to our next presenter, Brian Vessa. Brian Vessa is Executive Director of Digital Audio Mastering at Sony Pictures, where, amongst other things, he supervises the home theater mixes of movie soundtracks. He was the founding chairman of SMPTE Technology Committee 25 CSS for cinema sound systems, where he has guided the development of many of the SMPTE standards for such things as object-based immersive audio and calibration procedures. He is the chairman of the IMF Interoperable Master Format Audio Essence Committee. He has participated in the creation of multiple standards for digital cinema, immersive audio, MXF, IMF, and HDR, amongst others. He has a strong background as a mixer of both music and films. Brian will present the perspective of a major film studio in preparing movie soundtracks for TV. Please welcome Brian Vessa.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Vessa from Sony Pictures, and I'm here to talk about preparing how I do these mixes, which I call translating. So I have a little overview here. We're going to look at the characteristics of some theatrical movie soundtracks, talk about why we don't actually want to use them directly for home, talk about some home theater mixing equipment, my mix process, some of the immersive sound reproduction challenges at home, how we might remix for immersive home theater and upmix for immersive home theater, touch a little bit on a delivery workflow, and then we'll have a summary. So movie soundtracks are really made for a big room. They're very dynamic, and that really makes something cinematic. There's a wide variation in the overall level, and dialogue level can move around quite a bit. If you hear it at the right playback level in a good theater, you can hear dialogue that's very quiet and very loud, and you can hear all this wonderful quiet detail from background sounds and all that kind of stuff. And it's really wonderful. And then when the loud stuff comes in, it really makes an impact. And when the directors and sound designers mix for the theater, they go for these dynamics because they really get you, because it brings you into the story. So why won't we use that for home? I mean, after all, these mixes, they're .wav files. They can be used. So they don't look any different if you just look at them on a screen or look at them in a computer. And the theatrical mix is director approved, so I should use it, right? But there's a little problem with that because the typical home environment, as we've already heard tonight from others, very different than a cinema. It's a much smaller room, smaller speakers. Maybe it's got a sound bar. We're listening out of TV speakers, computer speakers, or even a mobile device. The typical playback levels is 10 to 20 dB lower than it was mixed for the theater. And so the net effect of that is that our perceived balance is different. You know, psychoacoustically, we hear things differently at different levels and also in different spaces and things like that. So the perceived balance, our perceived balance of the dialogue, music, and effects is much different than what they signed off on when the director listened to the mix. So that same soundtrack that's really wonderful and dynamic in a theater can be nearly inaudible during normal dialogue and subtle music sections and very loud in the big music sections when we try to listen to this at home. And I call it watching with the remote in hand. I don't know how many of you would do that, but first thing I do when I get a movie, I want to sit down with my wife to watch a movie, so I'll get the remote control and put it in my hand, and so I can bring it up for the dialogue and bring it down for the other stuff. So the theatrical mix just doesn't sound the same as what was signed off in the mixing theater, and actually the directors and producers are starting to realize this now that we've had several years of people bringing DVDs home and people, having Blu-rays, and now we have streaming, and they go, well, that just doesn't sound like it did when I mixed it. Well, it's because they needed to do what sound guru Vesa says. Prior to delivering a movie soundtrack to the home, whether it be physical or digital means, it should receive a home theater mix to optimize the soundtrack for home listening. It's my mantra. So what is this home theater mix concept that I'm talking about here? So the objective is to literally translate the mixing intent into a home-sized space with a lower playback volume and a smaller visual image. So ideally, if you do your job right, if you were able to do the magic A-B comparison of being able to listen in a theater and what it sounds like in the theater, and then listen at home with this newly balanced home theater mix, you should get the same impression of the movie. That's what you're trying to achieve with this. It's a translation process. And so one of the big reasons to do it is that it's really the mix that's going to be heard. I mean, theatrical runs are short, and we're going to hear the movie at home for many years. That's going to be what people reference. You could, if you are like the way a lot of films are today, they're crammed really hard to the end trying to make that deadline, and it's nice to be able to do a little fine spit and polish on the mix in a near-field environment where you can really hear really nice through the speakers. I can hear all that detail that's a little harder to get when you have a big white filter. And I want to emphasize a couple of things. It's a creative process and not an automated process. This is not something where you take the theatrical mix and jack up the level and put down some compression on top and shrink the dynamic range and say, oh, now this is my home mix, because I don't think anything sounds worse than that. And the other thing is my mantra is that for a new movie, you want to have this be part of the production process. So after they finish all the theatrical mixing and finish the M&E and all that's done, you immediately continue right on and do the home mix using a mixer that mixed the movie, knows the movie inside and out, knows all the decisions that went into the movie and how everything was arrived at, knows where the bones are buried, so to speak, and where the gotchas are. I think that's a very important part of this. So we've already seen this diagram. This is a basic 5-1 speaker layout, with 3 speakers in an arc, 60 degrees, and then the 2 surrounds at 110 degrees, very classic ITU setup. I think that the way to do this when you're picking out your equipment is you use flat, full-range speakers with good detail, They shouldn't be speakers that flatter. They should be very just nice and flat. And so some typical, it might be like a 5/8-inch woofer, 1-inch cone tweeter. I recommend avoiding speakers that are voiced for cinema, where they've already got some sort of cinema curve built in, or they're in some way voiced to mimic cinema. That's not what you want when you're doing a home theater mix. You want like a nice flat, speaker with good detail. So then those are like your main speakers that you use, and a stereo pair of lo-fi speakers or a sound bar, typical TV with internal speakers that you can check how that translates. I think it's important to have AC3 encode decode with bass management in the monitor chain that you can switch in and out to check the effects of that, because that's pretty much how everybody's going to hear it. And you need some good peak limiting to avoid overs. And I mean literally peak limiting, like it doesn't kick in until the very, very top. It's not something where you're squashing. It's not a program limiting. It's just a peak stopper so that you don't hit the overs. My recommended monitor level is 75, which is 10 dB down from the cinema. And I think if the soundtrack is very bold, you might even want to go a little lower than that. You have to remember, people at home have volume controls. They're going to set it. In the mixing process, I check the mix a little louder and a little softer to make sure everything's translating, but I make my final decisions in the 72 to 75 range. I start with the widest format and work down. So usually at a minimum, it's 5.1 and 2-track. And then I always play the 2-track mix on some lo-fi speakers or a standard TV, even 10 dB lower than that, to kind of simulate more like how everybody's going to hear it. So how do we do this? We start with the theatrical wide stems. Those of you who are in the business know that wide stems means you just don't have dialogue, music, and effects. Dialogue is maybe split up into principal dialogue and crowds and wall and stuff like that. The effects are split up into backgrounds and Foley and hard effects and things like that. That gives you a much wider palette to play with when you have wide stems, and this is pretty common that mixers mix this way today. I start by just putting all the stems straight across like you would, just exactly like they did for the theatrical print master. That's kind of your starting point. And then listen to a bunch of different areas in the movie and make a sort of a little adjustment generally in the balance of those stems to make it sound like it did, in the cinema. Just get that balance. Usually that's dialogue up a little bit and music and effects back a little bit, but it varies a little bit for every movie. Once you kind of have a general balance that you feel is sort of working, then I always just overall check the tonal balance in different places. Most of the time, I don't find that I have to apply a general equalization, but sometimes you do. But most of the time, it's just like little things like will pop out, or some Foleys will be super bright, or stuff like that you can work with. But varies a little bit for every movie. Then before I actually start making any serious adjustments, I go to the really loud, bold sections of the movie, and I see how much gain reduction you would have to apply to stay out of overs. And this, to me, is a very important part of the deal, because I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding that the whole idea here is that you're stomping down on the dynamics of the mix, and you're trying to make the mix have, compress it down so it doesn't have that excitement, and that's not what you want to do. You want to go to those sections, find them. If the movie's been mixed just crazy loud, you might decide to take all the faders down a certain number of dB to kind of get you to where you're not, buried in the limiters. You're just tickling a little bit, and then at that point bring up the quiet stuff underneath it, and that's a much more natural way to attain a reduced dynamic range, and your ears like it a lot better, and it still gives you the dynamics and part of that storytelling that was, it does the entire part of the storytelling that they intended to do. Then once you kind of know where that's at and you've sort of got your range together, then you go in and you adjust the specific sounds. You listen to the movie, some quiet dialogue you might need to raise, certain things, quiet music cues or the starts of music cues. You may want to bring them up a little so they're not down in the dirt. Because again, when you had that big wide dynamic range in the theater, all that subtlety is really great because you can hear it. But at home, all that subtlety is down here below where you can hear it, and you want to sort of bring things in so you're not on your volume control all the time, but you do it in a creative fashion. You don't do it in a formulaic fashion, right? You do what what seems to be needed. And I always recommend that you have the bass management available. And of course, what bass management's going to do is it's going to take all the low frequencies, usually 80 cycles is the common one for home. So anything under 80 cycles will get rolled off from your main speakers and will go into the subwoofer. This is not how it works in cinema. Cinema doesn't use bass management in that fashion. So sometimes you might get very surprised when you listen in bass management, you know, like a little car idle all of a sudden is like really loud, or some, you know, various things can happen. Music cues, which were just like a little quiet cue with a couple little timpanis in the background, all of a sudden starts to get really too loud and kind of was not intended. And it's important to do that because home theater systems, of course, rely on bass management to get the low frequency content that they need. So if you do run into situations where you listen with the bass management and go, God, this feels wrong, that gives you an opportunity to do some selective filtering of your own to the front channels. And usually you just have to filter something like way down at 40 cycles or something, which would, you know, wouldn't have been heard anyway. So it's good to definitely have that in the loop. The other thing is you're looking at a much smaller screen than at cinema. Cinema, you've got this big wide screen and all this room. Pans can go all the way across and around, and they sound great. Sometimes at home, it's pretty disconcerting to have pans be flying way outside of the image, and so sometimes you bring certain pans in to sort of make it work a little bit better with the image. Once you finish that, you go on to the 2-track, which I call the Everyman's Mix, and be sure to listen to that on various small things, because that's the mix probably most people are actually going to hear. And this is probably also a good time to come up with an M&E and maybe a DME at the same time. So some stuff on immersive mixing, which I've been doing an awful lot of now at Sony. This is just a typical diagram. We've all seen this 7.1.4 setup, where now you basically have the speakers that were 110, you bring them up a little bit to 90 degrees, and then you've got the 7.1 speakers in the back, you know, around 150 degrees, and then the 4 speakers on the sides are the ones that are actually above you, so that's the 7.1.4. We all know that one. It's a pretty big challenge to actually translate something. If you mixed an immersive mix for the theater and it sounds really good in the theater and you listen to it at home, it can be incredibly underwhelming. You can have, so you have a sound bar, or maybe you certainly have much fewer speakers. There's problems with object resolution goes down because there's what they call clustering, and you usually only get 12 clusters or something like that for all the objects have to fit into. So it can vary quite a bit. One of the things people like to do is what they call the proscenium effect in Atmos, where you have the 2 top speakers and the 2 wide speakers, and you bring things off the screen a little bit. In 7.1.4, that doesn't really work that well, so you have to try to make some compensations to get that to actually go. So how do we mix for home theater? For immersive, follow the previous steps. Bring wide things in like we did. You probably find some object pans and trajectories and need a little adjusting. If it's a really crowded mix, you're going to run into that clustering problem, so you're going to probably adjust the balance and position of a few things. One of the things you'll note for sure when you get home is all that great stuff that you thought you had up really high doesn't translate very well at home, so you may need some additional level there or some additional angle to get that to work. And just consider the fact most people are going to hear on headphones or a soundbar. One of the things I've been doing quite a bit is upmixing, where you didn't start off with an immersive mix, but now you'd like to create one. And this has a lot of value add, I think, if you really tailor it for the home. These are just kind of my golden rules. The immersive mix should retain the feel of the original, but expand further in places where the original mix was wide. So you listen to kind of what the sound design was of the movie, and you see what the mixers were going for, and you just expand upon that. So it sticks with intent, but now you have a wider palette, a wider playing field to go with, so use it. Don't be shy. You've still got the existing mix. This is really a new mix now. So while it needs to be within the right intent, I think you've got a wider palette to play with, and subtle changes are just going to have very little impact, and nobody's going to hear them at home, so don't be shy. A few things that we like to do I'm really into creating immersive spaces. I like to play a lot with backgrounds, custom reverbs to bring you into a room space. It's not just all about throwing gunshots around in helicopters and stuff like that. Even though that's fun, I think one of the things that really brings you in immersively is to really create spaces, and you feel like you're in those spaces. And you can do that with your backgrounds. You can do that with speaking voice when they're in rooms. You can make that, sell that room that you're in, sell that cave that you're in, or wherever it is. It's really nice. Music can always be, pulled out a little bit and lifted. And one of the things you get to do is you have the opportunity to pan dialogue to match visual cues. If people are looking off over there, sometimes it's nice to have the sound come from over there where they were looking. One of the things to say about all of this is you can do a lot of this just with channel panning. You don't absolutely have to have objects to create all of those effects, but if you do want to add some objects to the palette, obviously they have additional functionality. We can create, if you only had channels to work with to start with, obviously you can copy and paste out of those onto object tracks and use those, very commonly done. I think there's enhanced functionality from doing that. And it's gotten to the point now where some of the mixers I've been working with, they don't use channels at all. They do everything in objects, and the only thing in the channel is the LFE track. So it kind of goes the other way, too. I've delivered both kinds of mixes. Immersive mixes have nothing but channels, and they never went to objects, and it's just all 714, and all the way to the other side where everything was objects. So it works both ways, actually. This is a little diagram that I did here, just showing across the top, that's your DCP chain, your theatrical mix, theatrical stems, and all that. You take those theatrical stems, you make a home theater mix and a home theater print master, do and conform, make your IMF, create your IMF. If you're doing an immersive mix, you make a home immersive print master and turn that into an IEB track, which is now standardized in SMPTE. And with that IMF, I can deliver to physical authoring, I can deliver to a digital partner, I can create edited versions and deliver to TV airlines. So the IMF has really made a big difference, I think, in our workflow. So in summary, theatrical soundtracks are very dynamic, don't always translate well to home listening. Home theater mixes optimize the movie soundtracks, help them translate to the home where the majority of people are going to see the movie and where it's going to live long after the theatrical run. You should always create 5, 1, and 2-track mixes. Don't resist the temptation to only create a 5.1 mix and imagine that the down mix is going to work, because that 2-track mix, when you customize it, really makes a big difference. That's really the everyman's mix. Immersive mixes can work well in the home if optimized, and home immersive mixes should have a differentiation that's perceivable at home to bring a value add to the consumer. Thanks.
Well, what a variety of information we've had this evening. We're not done. Scott Kramer. Scott joined Netflix in July of 2017 following 15 years in sound post-production. His career began with a strong technical foundation as a sound facility engineer and mix technician. At Technicolor, Warner Brothers, and Wildfire Post, he worked primarily in creative capacities as a re-recording mixer and supervising sound editor. At Netflix, he is tasked primarily with emerging sound technologies, writing the Netflix technical spec. He is involved with internal education and building the global audio infrastructure. Scott will present the perspective of a major online streaming service provider and details of their advanced and forward-thinking delivery specification. Please welcome Scott Kramer.
Hello. I'm Scott. I'm the manager for sound technology at Netflix. And as I was thinking about what to do for this presentation, I kept going back to the Netflix core company values. And they're not technical specs, but they're kind of our philosophy, which pervades everything that we do and how we get what we need throughout the company and from the content partners. And it really comes down to trust. And these are the two values that I think about all the time at work. Freedom and responsibility. Our goal is to inspire people rather than manage them. We trust our teams to do what they think is best for Netflix. This is really true, and it's not just internal. It's about the directors and the showrunners and the creatives that we work with. And we give them the freedom to work however they would like and work wherever they would like, because we trust them and we believe that they will feel a responsibility, not to us per se, but to their fans, to deliver a sound mix, in this case, that will translate really well in the home. And I see it all the time in my interactions with the showrunners and directors, where they crowd around a laptop on a huge mix stage to make sure that the mix is working there. Or they want to hear it encoded on the Netflix service before it launches and make sure that it, going through our entire chain, it all works for them and it's going to work for their fans. So it's all about empowering the people that we work with to be artists and to do whatever they feel is best. Some of those values that I also pulled out of the book would be that we encourage independent decision making, that they should, go to whatever facility they want, share open information openly, broadly, and deliberately, really keeping the dialogue open and being very open in our interactions with each other and with the people we work with. Avoiding rules. I really like this one as a person who was a mixer and did a lot of delivery and got a lot of QC reports. I like the idea of avoiding rules, and the core philosophy is people over process. So our core specs, to that end, our core specs are really very simple. The loudness is -27 ±2 LU dialogue gated. We have a good reason for this. And as Lon said earlier, it is 1770-1, though, when there are enough meters and devices in the field that support dialogue-based measurement to -4 or the future -5 ITU spec, we'll consider moving to that. At this point, Dolby Media Meter and many of the others are -1 devices, so we stick with that. And this is about, the reason for this is about having dialogue at a similar level for all the content, because you can't control everything else with the content, but what most of it has in common on the Netflix platform is dialogue. Whether it's a talk show or whether it's a film or a comedy special or a series, there's always dialogue. And this is what we know people adjust the level in their living room to have comfortable dialogue. And then they might ride the level if it gets loud or quiet, as others have spoken about tonight. So that's the core spec. And the other spec, if I can get it to come up, is the peaks. The peaks may not exceed -2 dB full scale. We also have a good reason for this, which is for the near field mix. It's the decoder, it's the device side, and not being able to control how the decoding is implemented, because if mixes go to full scale, they can actually create audible distortion. Dolby and a lot of the proprietary codecs protect for this, and look after the implementation, but for open codecs, there isn't that control. So we have all of the mixes not have peaks which exceed 2 dB full scale. That would be the near field sound spec. Everything else is about file formatting, how to deliver in channel order, how to make the B-Wave ADM, sync it to the final IMF picture, things like that. That's all about organization, really. The core specs are just 2, and everything else is up to the mixer. Here's our theatrical sound spec. There's nothing there. You do whatever you need to do. There's total freedom on that. And that really, again, goes back to our core philosophy. Having said that, there are some minor updates that we had just before NAB to some of the specs. I'm all about looking through all of our documentation and removing anything that isn't absolutely necessary. Be that deliverables. In the deliverables list, I might go to different content categories and talk to the post-production managers in those groups and say, hey, do we really need this, or can we pull this out? Are we using this? And we want to only have the things that we need and are using. So for home Atmos, we removed the requirement for stems, because there's really no good way to make stems for Atmos, and we just ask that shows and films try to keep dialogue, music, and effects separate whenever they can. And if they can't, then we might have them split it out and do separate passes. And then the M&E may be delivered in a Pro Tools session, which others have allowed this, and now we do too. You don't need to run an Atmos master through the RMU for the M&E, just for the main mix. And then in the sound mix spec and best practices document, this is a great document which is only, I think it's like 5 or 7 pages long, and it as opposed to our full spec, technical spec, this is just sound, and so it really applies to this audience, and it cuts to the chase as far as what we're all interested in. We have some guidance that we publish and some kind of best practices and recommendations. That's really what I'm here to talk about, because we have so few enforced rules and specifications. We put a suggestion that you match the camera or editorial frame rate, because we can encode and stream any frame rate. So we have content on the service that's at 24, 25, 50 frame, all of that. And we're starting to see more and more films working at true 24 frame and shooting on the set at 24, posting at 24, and then ultimately delivering a 24 frame IMF and streaming at 24 frame, which is just great to see that. X-curve guidance, I'll get into that a little later. Advice on loudness range, also going to touch on that. And then we talk about 916 because it's a really nice near-field experience to have, especially the left wide and right wide speaker. They give you the ability to do the proscenium effect that Brian talked about and pull things a little off the screen, widen the front sound stage, which is really where the audience focus mostly is. But it's just optimal. It's not required. 714 is what we require for QC. And there is really, and that's kind of the de facto suggestion for creative mix. Although we have found that for clients and just a nice experience, 916 is really helpful. As far as room recommendations, we suggest if there's no large theatrical release, work in maybe a smaller room, focus on the near field version. Again, these are just recommendations, and the directors and showrunners are free to just ignore any of this if they want, and so are mixers. Medium or small stages, and we've talked about this tonight already, like a large living room, because that's where the content is heard. So why not be in a kind of a medium or small stage? A lot of the rectangular stages that we have around town, the TV stages, they're just perfect for Netflix for our content. So there isn't necessarily a reason to set up an additional speaker array around the console as we used to do. It can be fine in a lot of these medium stages to mix on the in-wall speakers. And I think for convenience sake, that's just realistically the way a lot of the facilities are doing it. And it seems to work fine for the members and the experience. Dolby has a modified X-curve that can work pretty well, or no X-curve. When we review mixes at Netflix from around the world, we generally have no X-curve on that. So we can hear everything that's streaming to the members and not lose any of those high frequencies. We want to have immersive audio whenever possible as a top-level audio master. Trim passes for lower channel formats, so that means work in an Atmos room, mix in Atmos, derive the 5.1 and the stereo mixed from that, and natively in Atmos, where we try to avoid upmixing, though, as Brian said, upmixing can provide a great experience if it's done right and carefully and the time and effort is put into it. But working in Atmos rooms. Overall, I think the recommendation is spend the budget with more days mixing in smaller rooms to perfect the experience, to do everything the director wants, rather than less days in a very expensive room. And having said that, though, there's always films that do have a large theatrical release, and more Netflix, we have those, and we have theatrical releases in commercial cinemas. So for a lot of our films, it makes more sense to stick with the traditional model, mix in a large room, spend just a little bit, a week or so in a smaller room, a near field mix doing that. But in many cases, mix the near field first and then theatrical later. This is something we're starting to think about. If there's no big theatrical theatrical release, maybe mix the near field first. That's when we know that we're not going to a lot of theaters. We need a theatrical mix for marketing screenings, for promotion and things like that. And for a small number of screenings, we're talking like sometimes less than 5 screenings. It doesn't necessarily make sense to spend less time in a huge stage when millions of people are going to hear the near field version. So this is something we're thinking about on some of the films. Focus on the M&E, because so many millions around the world hear the dub mixes. They hear the foreign language mixes. So we want to get a great M&E. However, the M&E depth of fill notes that we get from QC vendors are not kind of an absolute. And we're moving away from that model where it's, you've received a rejection in the M&E, you must fix this. We're trying to move, we have a new tool called Asset QC where we're trying to move into a place where it's more of a conversation, and the mixer can respond and say, this was my intent was to keep it this way, and then we can waive that note, that M&E note. So focus on the M&E. We want a great M&E. That's the thought behind the QC process, and we want it to match the original mix. We found that one way to get where you need to be loudness-wise is to have a nice tight loudness range for the dialogue. It doesn't seem to, in many cases, it doesn't affect the mix creatively as much. You can still go big with effects or go big with music when you need to. But we found that members have much less of an incidence of kind of complaining about dialogue intelligibility if the dialogue loudness range is fairly tight. That means that no dialogue is super low or super loud. It's all kind of in the pocket. This is one way to get to having a really nicely balanced mix. We've seen mixers deliver one mix for near field and theatrical. This doesn't always work. It usually probably may not work, but this has happened before where a mixer creates a mix that just has a little bit more aggressive dialogue and delivers it for both. I know back in the day, I did a lot of mixes for films that were appearing in festivals, and I would kind of push the dialogue a little bit, knowing that the theater would either be turned down or it would be adjusted for the screening. And then my near field mix also worked for theatrical. This can happen when the mixers are okay with it, and we've had several approach us and say, hey, I think my theatrical mix will work for the platform, can you measure it? We measure it, and the dialogue's right where it needs to be, because our spec has a pretty big window of 4 LU, and it's at -27. It's kind of in a premium TV area, so the dialogue doesn't have to be quite as up as it might be in some broadcasters. So sometimes that mix will work for both, and then you've got half the deliverables you otherwise would have. And then this is our kind of overall loudness range and dynamic range message, which is sound mixes which are not overly dynamic play best for our members. And it isn't, again, not a rule, not enforced, but loudness range, we know that if it's 18 LU or less, it tends to be the best experience. And when things get into an LRA measurement of 20 or more, we tend to see a correlation statistically with lots of complaints that it's hard to understand. So that's the kind of guidance there is don't be overly dynamic with your near field mix. There it is, LRA of no more than 18. So to get to some of the content, I mean, this is really the reason for being, and for me personally, it's really inspiring to see what a lot of the crews we work with do. To call out a couple, the comedy special Ellen DeGeneres, we had 20 microphones in the theater in Seattle and recorded it, and all they were was panned out in the Atmos sound field, and standing in the room listening to it in Atmos really feels like you're in the crowd enjoying it. And we found for comedy that Atmos works really well. Roma, I was on a panel with Skip Livesey and Sergio Diaz, and they talked about Alfonso Cuarón wanting to bring the audience into the frame with a mix that really, it's a theatrical mix, it's a theatrical experience. It works well on a streaming platform, it works well in a nice home Atmos setup. It works well a lot of these mixes work well on a good soundbar. There's a lot of good soundbars that are coming out that do a pretty decent job They won't get you what a full separate system will get you, but they're getting much better. Roma was so interesting because it broke so many of the rules that we have. And it was an example of that complete artistic freedom. And I was just captivated by the sound. So if you haven't heard it, if you can get a chance to hear it in a good home Atmos room, give it a shot, because it's a really amazing film. These kind of things, all of these titles and many more, they really inspire us to want to do the best job we can protecting that experience for the members. And one way that we've done that recently is a high quality audio feature, which we launched on May 1st. And what we did was we upgraded a couple of the streams. We upgraded Dolby Digital Plus to 640 kilobit. We were at 192 kilobit. We now have a variable bit rate, or several different bit rates, a whole bit rate ladder that varies from 192 to 640. So as your bandwidth increases, you get a better bit rate, and as it decreases, it can go down smoothly. That's the adaptive streaming engine that we built. We upgraded the Atmos streams to 768 kilobit per second, and we built this adaptive streaming engine, and that was what took the majority of the work. And I got to work with some incredible engineers in Los Gatos who put that together and are just as passionate about fixing difficult problems and making things better as we are down in Southern California at the studio. You can read a lot about that on medium.com at the Netflix tech blog, or just Google higher quality audio, Netflix blog, anything like that. It'll all come up. And that was a really fun thing to be able to do, to basically protect the mix all the way to the member. And now we can confidently go to our showrunners and our collaborators, the creatives, and say, your 5.1 mix can sound identical at home streaming off of your Apple TV as it sounded in the studio. If you have the right speakers, we can't control the speakers, but what we're doing is removing any impediments in the pipe, and we're coding everything. It's a lossy codec, but we're coding everything that the ears can hear. So we have data from Dolby and our own internal listening tests showing that it's a perceptually transparent bit rate. There's no audible difference between the uncompressed master and the stream. This is pretty huge, and I'm really glad we were able to do it for the members and for the creators of the content. Another project that I'm working on is immersive capture on set, getting really interesting mics out into the field, especially for documentaries, comedy specials. I just thought I'd throw this in there, but it's a fun thing, and it comes from being inspired by the content and the work. We're trying all kinds of different microphones, and we're loaning them out. There's several out in the field right now. The idea behind this is capture everything that those amazing cameras are capturing, get that complete 360-degree sound field, and then offer it up to the sound designer as just a bed, a basis, maybe just a point of reference that they throw away or don't use. Maybe use it, maybe make it part of the mix, but give them the ability to hear more that happened on the set. And here's some of the mics we're using. We just used the ORTF 3D mic last week for a shoot here in LA. A lot of fun stuff. I'm going to conclude with this quote also from the culture information, the Netflix culture information on the website. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. This is about creative freedom. It's about giving the showrunners and the authors of the great content the ability to do whatever they think is best, because we know that if they care more than anyone, and if they are given that opportunity, they're going to make something that's amazing for our members. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. It was really refreshing to hear how much the respect is given the artists, and I guess that's one of the reasons they're such a successful business.